What I'd like to share with you today is how we are using student-level data to improve well-being and increase achievement here in an international school in Bangkok, Thailand. A little bit about our school, first of all. We are a small school. We have only 400 students from age 2 to 18. We're a British curriculum school. We offer the English National Curriculum modified to a local context up until IGCSE, year 10 and 11, and then A-level. We are mostly Thai, with some Korean and Taiwanese students, and we're almost entirely EAL, if one defines that in terms of students for whom English really is another language other than their mother tongue. And important for all of you to understand, we are starting from scratch with data this year. I joined the school this year, and the school had made no tangible use of student-level data before that. So what I'm sharing with you now is what we have experienced and discovered over just 6 months of using the CAT4 and the PASS survey. So hopefully the fact that we're in this context will sound familiar to some of you, and hopefully that will prove helpful. First of all, though, I want to talk to you about what I call the Mona Lisa effect. I remember back to my honeymoon, I think it was, in Paris in the mid-90s. And I remember seeing the Mona Lisa on her wall in her small room. And I remember wanting to test her out. I remember having been mystified and intrigued from a young age about whether she definitely did look at you wherever you went. And I started to move around the gallery, or around the room, to see whether indeed she was still looking at me. After a while, and to my wife's intense embarrassment, I started to jump around a little bit, hide in this corner, leap up in that corner, and see if she still was looking. And indeed, she was. The illusion was complete and was perfect. Of course, her eyes were not moving, but it was my perception that they were. And for me, as a teacher and a senior leader, it's precisely that effect that I believe we should all be achieving in our classroom. It's all the more difficult with a cohort that has vast range of ability or vast range of language acquisition, but it's something that we must truly strive for, because really, if this student over here is sitting there thinking, this is strange, this lesson's been designed specifically for me, and yet the student across from them, the other side of the room, is thinking, no, you're wrong there, this lesson's been designed specifically for me, and then another student at the back is thinking, no, you're both wrong, it's been designed for me. The illusion that actually every single student is being targeted directly and specifically is what we're going for. In other words, we're going for personalization, we're going for differentiation. And to all data folks out there, to all teachers who prefer to consider their students as young human beings with all the soft edges that young human beings have, I would say this: we cannot truly understand the human being in front of us in terms of their potential, in terms of what they could achieve, without the data to underpin it. For me, it's about a triangle. If we truly understand the data for any particular student, we can truly understand that student and we can truly meet their needs. Obviously, we need to understand where they are at. We need to look at their prior and current attainment and decide where they are at the moment. And generally, teachers are really good at that. In international schools also, teachers are used to measuring prior and current attainment. And that's fine. But that's not what's going to make the true difference. But then we need to look at aptitude. We need to think, okay, this student has achieved that level, but what could they do? What could they achieve if they truly fulfilled their potential? Often there is a gap between those two, as we all well know. What a child is achieving and what they could be achieving are often not the same thing, which is why some underachievement is very common throughout a kid's schooling, and certainly when you get towards those tricky teenage years. So, if the attainment is low, but the aptitude is high, or if the attainment is high, but the aptitude is much higher, we complete the triangle by looking at that student's attitude. What is it about the way that they approach life, they approach their learning, and they approach school that might be contributing to that chasm between attainment and aptitude. And this is the triangle that I think we need to understand. Coming from a UK background, I've long been used to central government making demands on me and my students in terms of their attainment. But I've never been that interested in it. And one of the great things about working in the international sector is one doesn't have that sort of arbitrary pressure. What I'm always more interested in is a student's achievement. How are they doing in relation to their potential, as opposed to are they getting a grade A? And at Bromsgrove, I'm far more interested in these three grades when we look at their reports than whether or not they're getting an A, a C, an E for attainment. I want to know if they are dramatically underachieving, if they're doing nowhere near as well as they could and should be, or if they're working towards their capability and with a bit more of an extra push and some strategic intervention, they could get there. Or if actually they're already doing as well or even better than we could possibly have expected them to do. These are the grades that now appear on our termly reports, and these are the grades that I'm most interested in. And if I can educate our parents to have the same viewpoint, a road down which we have taken quite a few steps, our parents will also see these grades as the most important. And how do we get to these grades? Well, you'll know if you are current CAP4 users that the CAP4 generates for you a target grade, an indicative target grade. If a child with those CAP scores were to study at that particular age level, these are the grades they're most likely to get. We use that grade to start our whole target setting process. But here, again, unlike in the UK, where I was constantly challenged to show progress from, a child got this level in year 6, therefore we need to add this many thirds of a level on top of that. I've never agreed with that, because what if that original level was itself an underachievement? In adding a certain number of levels to that, all we're doing is perpetuating an expectation of continued underachievement. I'm far more interested in looking at progress towards. Let's set a rigorous, aspirational and challenging goal, and let's help our children to get there. So, how do we do that? We take here at Bromsgrove the if challenged grade that comes out of the CAP4 indicative target. After all, why would we not challenge them? Why would we not go the extra mile? Why would we not stretch them with rigor to go for something truly aspirational? So we have that if challenged grade. What we then do is ask our teachers to comment on that, perhaps sometimes to refine it. Perhaps if a child's prior attainment suggests that target grade is too low, we would take that grade up. Perhaps that child has a particular talent in a particular area. Perhaps their CAP grades have suggested C's and B's, but they are a tremendously gifted sportsman or woman. Therefore, we allow the teachers to refine it. We will then backfill it to the preceding year groups. So the CAP gives you an end of key stage target, and then we trace that back with our own formula to provide a target for the end of each year group. That then gives each student a target minimum grade. Now, at the moment here, we don't share that with the students and the parents. We're starting a journey here. It's a pilot this year, and I hope to be able to do so in the future. But at the moment, we don't. That's for our teachers. But with that grade, we can then let the students know at every juncture whether they are U, underachieving, W, working towards, or A, achieving or exceeding their target. Also, once we have those target minimum grades, we can use that to agree the teaching groups and the sets. And as our students get older in secondary, we increasingly set them in the core subjects. And what is fantastic here is that then we can set by potential rather than by prior attainment, thereby putting the underachieving, gifted and talented students into a top set rather than letting them languish in a set for which they are not appropriately placed. Then we can track the students' progress towards those targets, and then we can trigger the intervention and reward that follows. And one of the amazing things here at Bromsgrove with this system, which is a very simple system that probably many of you do, is that finally we are bigging up and celebrating and writing home about and cheering about the students who've got an A because they have achieved their potential of, say, a C grade. And we are saying that is amazing, rather than only in the past celebrating those students who get to an A for attainment. But we use the CAPs a lot more than that. But this is a start point. You'll see here, we're looking at a particular Year 11 cohort. You can see how those achievement and progress grades come out. You can see here the students who are on track to achieve or exceed their target, for instance, in the maths there. We can see in the English here, there are a lot more W's. We can see there are some U's here. And as you can see, what I then start to do is calculate where there is the greatest need of intervention. Where are kids most underachieving? And you can look at this student here, who in 40% of their subjects is getting a U, in 20% is getting a W. They are underachieving perhaps more than any other. They have 2 U's here in ICT and science and 1 in English. And we can then start truly to track where kids need that intervention because they're not achieving their potential. Without the CAPs, we wouldn't be able to do this because we would just be guessing. But for me, this isn't the exciting thing about Cat4. For me, it's the scores themselves. And I'm going to have to make the assumption here that all participants are familiar enough with the 4 batteries that the Cat4 tests on. The verbal, which is thinking through words, the quantitative, thinking through number, the non-verbal, and the spatial, both of which look at more conceptual ability. And I'm going to have to assume that you're aware that the scores range from 59 to 141, with 100 being the average score, and that it's divided into 9 stay 9 or bands. I'm going to have to assume you have that knowledge. What I think then we can do is something quite exciting. This is particularly relevant for schools with a high proportion of EAL students. Let's look at our student body in terms of 4 quadrants, 4 learning quadrants. Let's look at quadrant A as students who have a high verbal aptitude, but they have a low non-verbal aptitude. A high verbal score, the score is going to be well in excess of 100 probably, but their non-verbal score is considerably lower than that verbal aptitude. So this type of student is not so common in your international school with a high EAL component, because it's exactly this sort of student that's more common perhaps in a working class native English speaking area in the UK. These are kids who have been brought up on English, they have had English all around them, but they don't have the conceptual ability to match it. Quadrant B is students who have a high verbal score and a high non-verbal score. So these are students who are, have a tremendous aptitude across the board. And these are going to be your high flyers, your typical gifted and talented students who will really need a lot of stretch and will do exceptionally well. But the next 2 quadrants are the ones that we focus on a little bit more. Quadrant C are those students with a low verbal score and a low non-verbal score. Typically, these will be students who have some degree of learning need or learning difficulty, either specific or global, but perhaps needs exploring and diagnosing further and support to be kicked in. But most of our students here, and any other teachers listening to this who are in a school with a high proportion of kids at an early stage of English language acquisition, would be in quadrant D. Quadrant D is students with a low verbal aptitude and a high non-verbal aptitude. These are students whose minds are operating at a very high level, but who don't have the language to keep up with it. And these are the students that we're dealing with here. And what I would call this difference is what I'm calling the verbal deficit, the difference between a child's verbal score and their non-verbal score. Because for me, that is more significant in identifying the true potential and the true needs of your EAL students than any other combination of scores with the CAPs. If the non-verbal score is dramatically above the verbal score, then the chances are they're going to need some very specific EAL intervention. What this also enables us to do then is to flag our kids and begin a register for SEN, for EAL and for G&T. And some international schools are still at the beginning of that process. So instantly with your quadrant B, you've got your gifted and talented student. Instantly with your quadrant C, you've got the beginnings of your SEN register. And instantly with your quadrant D, you've got your EAL cohort. It also enables us to distinguish between EAL and SEN, because here, where the vast majority of our students have quite a low level of English, it's hard without this data to identify which students, even if their mother tongue, would struggle with learning, and which students it's just a language issue for. So with the CAPs here, we can make that distinction and actually support appropriately. And as I've said, we've got a very unique challenge here. Some of you may be in schools that are very similar, But here at Bromsgrove, we have a massive majority of our students who have very low level of language acquisition in English for their age. And yet a large number of our students are exceptionally able as well. And we are immersing them in an English language medium, British style, very academic education. And we're expecting them to do that in a language other than their mother tongue. And we've got to understand then truly where their learning potential lies in order to make sure that they're not just going to have a frustrating and irritating and difficult time with us. If we look at our scores, to give you a bit of a measure here, you look at the scores for our year 1 up to our year 13. We can start to get some interesting pictures here. We can compare the year groups. For instance, if you look at the verbal deficit here, our youngest students, year 1 and 2 and 3, have the lowest verbal deficit of all. And as our students get older, as they get into older year groups, the verbal deficit increases. Now, the reason for this with us is that we take a large number of kids from Thai government schools when we get into year 7 and beyond, and you can see instantly the effect that that has on the verbal deficit of our particular year groups. You can see at the top the verbal scores and how those differ. You can see quite how gifted a lot of our students are in terms of their quantitative ability. But what you can also do is to start to deploy the support provision appropriately. Year 3, as you can see here, is not going to need a vast amount of support of any kind because they're very strong across the board. But you can see that year 8 and year 9 have a very low verbal aptitude, a very high verbal deficit, and therefore they're going to need some serious intervention in terms of EAL, apart from anything else, because they're only a year or 2 away from their IGCSE courses. What you can also do is plan for future needs. We can see, almost like a weather forecast, we can see what profile of year group is coming around the corner, is in some sort of occluded front across the Atlantic and moving our way. And we can start to understand then what our needs will be in 1 year's time, in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time. Look at the year 8 and 9. What will they be like when they're in year 10 and 11? And what challenges will that present us with in terms of our IGCSEs? And you can also start to consider admissions decisions. We are increasingly using the CAPS in terms of making the right admissions decision. And do we want to be taking more students into year 8 and 9 who have that high verbal deficit at the risk of further diluting our ability to meet the needs of those who are currently there? And then you'll find there are anomalies. And this is where your data folks have a field day, because they will look at students like this. Let me describe for you Harry. Harry, as you can see, has a very average set of CAP scores. Harry has 106 for his verbal score, which is okay. It's above average, it's all right. His quantitative score at 104, again, is okay. So is his non-verbal, and even his spatial. Even his spatial is only a couple of points below that average, 100. And so one would suggest, these would suggest he's an average student who can do okay in terms of IGCSE. Probably he's going to be a C grade kid, and he'll be all right. No major needs, no major successes. But then look at Charlie. Charlie has a very low verbal score of 80 points. That's very low considering he's a year 13 student. So that's very low indeed. But look at his other three. For quantitative, he has 140. For non-verbal, he has 141. And for spatial, he has 139. Now, these are almost full marks in a test in which it's very difficult to get full marks. So if you look at these two students, what would you think would be their likely outcomes? The truth is that Harry here has long been regarded the star of the school. He won all of the awards in previous years. Everyone considers him to be one of the most able students in the whole school. His parents are very, very supportive and confident in him. He is very confident about himself. And as a result, his attainment is far better than these scores would suggest. Charlie, however, if I tell you that Charlie is only doing one A-level, because that's all that he and his parents and the school felt that he could manage. So we've got a student with sort of mediocre potential who's doing exceptionally well, and a student with exceptional potential who's not doing very well at all. A data phobe might look at this and say, well, that's because the data's nonsense. That's because you can't decide a child's potential based on a computerized test. But I would say the opposite. If you look at Charlie's verbal deficit, Charlie's verbal deficit is 61. That is enormous. Some students don't even have a verbal score of 61. And so Charlie has spent the whole of his schooling being given, probably, an education suited to a student whose verbal score is 80, rather than to a student whose other scores are at the top of the scale. And so Charlie has grown to believe that he doesn't have tremendous ability or potential. As a result, so have his teachers and his parents. And what he has become is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Whereas, if we could have gone back in time and persuaded Charlie back in year 6 or year 7 or year 8, and persuaded his teachers as well that he is exceptional, and I believe he would have achieved exceptional results and he would be a top student in year 13 today. What this shows to me is that the anomalies themselves are not the problem. They're actually part of the solution. And the conversations that follow about those anomalies with staff are incredibly useful. So Harry has data that's weak at his perception. So Charlie has data that's stronger. To me, that shows that there's something else beneath the tip of that iceberg. And that is where the PASS survey for us at Bromsgrove has come in indescribably useful. So those of you who aren't familiar with the PASS, the student is asked to about 50 different statements. They're asked to say whether or not it's very true for them, slightly true, not very true, or not true at all. And we were able to offer these statements in Mandarin Chinese, in Korean, in Thai, and in English. And therefore, there was no language barrier to them accessing this. It took them 10, 15 minutes, and what it generated for us was a very sophisticated, standardized score under 9 different headings. And here are the 9 different headings that it gave us. And this affected a paradigm shift in terms of our staff's approach to the students that we have in this school. It was enormous. Everything changed. Because once we saw what the individual students thought about themselves and felt about their learning and their opinions about their school experience, once we truly saw that, it opened our eyes in a very dramatic way. Some of these for us were more useful and interesting than others, but I'll give you some idea of how we fared. Looking at year 3 up to year 13, because the PASS secondary is slightly different from the younger children. So we've got PASS scores for year 1 and 2, but year 3 and up we've got all of these 9 attitudes. You can see some very interesting pictures coming out of this. For instance, look at our year 4. Our year 4 has some very low scores. This isn't surprising to us. Our year 4 has had quite a disrupted year for a number of reasons. They had an unfortunate start, and therefore you can see that climate factors over which they, and perhaps we have no control, can affect and will affect their attitude to learning. And if we've seen with Charlie and Harry from the slide before, that can then affect their attainment. We've got some alarm bells ringing here about things we're going to need to do with year 4. I'd say year 8 is a concern as well, because the year 8 scores suggest the year group actually that has quite a low attitude towards their learning and their school experience. We've noticed also as a school that the perceived learning capability is much lower than many of the others. So we've got some very high scores along here, but at 42, both our perceived learning capability and our learner self-regard are low for us. That's the average across the whole school. This suggests that our students don't generally think that they are anywhere as able, perhaps, as they are, or they have a low opinion of their own capability. Also, that they have a low opinion of themselves. This suggests that we have a student body that is lacking in confidence, that doesn't have a tremendously positive view of themselves and their own potential. Now, that would tie in with a very high sort of deferential and diffident self-attitude. But I think this is beyond culture. I think that there's an interesting message coming out here about our students. We also observed that our response to curriculum score was quite low as well. This suggests that what we are offering, the content and the style of delivery in which we provide our curriculum, isn't perhaps perceived as a really close fit to many of our students. So on a whole cohort level, a whole school level, I'm drawing from this that we need to do something about our kids' self-perception and self-regard. And perhaps we need to explore why there isn't perceived to be a perfect fit between what we offer and what they need. There are also some interesting scores for attitude towards teachers. This is not as simple. Teachers can get scared of this, and that can easily happen. Teachers can think it's about whether students like them or not. It's not. It's far more about a much more complicated dynamic of mutual trust, mutual respect, and mutual value between both those stakeholder groups. But clearly there are some issues in Year 6 and Year 12 that again we need to look at. So even before we drill down for individual student scores, as a whole school, we've got some very powerful messages here that should and will feed into the strategic development of the school over the coming months and years. And then I started to look more deeply at the correlation between the CATs and the pass. On an individual level, it's fascinating, but on a whole school level, it's even more eye-opening. Here we've got a graph where on the left-hand side, you can tell I'm not a mathematician, on the y-axis, we have a student's attitude towards their teachers. This is a standardized score within the path where 100 is as high as it can be and 0 is as low as it can be. We have along the x-axis the learner's self-regard, so their attitude towards themselves, I suppose. And again, from 0 to 100. Now, in a very self-aware school, where the students were very, very self-aware, I suppose, and very balanced, you would find most of the coordinates appearing quite close to this line. Again, apologies that I'm not speaking with suitably mathematical terminology, but I'm an English teacher who's trying to get his head around data. If a student feels that have a low opinion about themselves, and they also have a low opinion about teachers, it kind of would feed into a more pervasive kind of low morale and low mood and low emotional well-being. But for our students, it didn't come out like that. As you can see, the majority of our students came up this side, a large number of them bunched up here, virtually none bunched down here. So what this tells us is what we kind of knew deep down anyway, is that our students generally have a very high opinion of the teachers and yet not a very high opinion of themselves. And that sends a quite profound message about some of the things we need to change in kind of the mindset of our students. I think back to schools that I taught in London, that I loved teaching in London. One of the great things about the students there was almost the opposite to this. They had real confidence. Their opinion of themselves perhaps was actually quite high, and they wanted the teacher to prove themselves worthy of the respect and the attention and the behavior and the work that the teacher wanted from the student. Here we've got an opposite challenge. We have students who culturally perhaps, or just personally, rate the adult world very highly and don't rate themselves very highly at all. And that for us is going to be a big challenge over the coming years. We want to grow the confidence in our students. This graph I found the most interesting of all. On the left-hand side, again, on a scale of standardized age scores of 0 to 100, we have the students' perceived learning capability. Here we have how able they think they are. Now, you'd expect students to fall anywhere between the 0 to 100, and that would be perfectly healthy. Along the x-axis, at the bottom of the screen, we have a slightly adjusted mean CATS score. I've taken away here what I will call the clutter of the verbal and the quantitative score. It's my experience that the verbal and the quantitative score can be schooled. They can be biased by a child's prior schooling. And also with us, here with a massive EAL contingent, they can also be skewed massively because the verbal score is just going to be low. So in terms of thinking, and I don't like the word, but I'll use it, in terms of thinking about how bright a student is, how able they are, I think sometimes it can be useful to strip away the clutter of verbal and quantitative. And that's what I've done here. So I've taken the child's non-verbal and spatial needs. I've taken their conceptual ability according to the CATS. Now, again, if we had a very self-aware student body who truly understood and believed in their own potential. You would expect most students to appear somewhere on this line or close to this line, because if they were pretty average at about 100 in terms of their conceptual ability and their potential, one would hope that they sort of knew that, and that was where they judged themselves to be. But when I show you where our coordinates fall, I think it does reveal again a very unique challenge that we've got to face. I say unique, however, but I suspect that there are many other international schools and schools with a high EL component who would find themselves in a similar position. This for me is staggering. The sheer weight of the bunching of coordinates over in this corner. Basically, our students are exceptionally able. Almost all of them have a nonverbal spatial mean above 89, which places them in the average range or above. Only 2 or 3 of our students have a nonverbal spatial mean, placing them below the average range. Our students are very able, but look about what they think of themselves. They don't think they're able at all. In fact, they don't have a very high opinion of their potential whatsoever. And we've got a real issue here, because what I fear, and it's borne out through further dialogue, is that our students are making a false correlation between verbal aptitude in the language of instruction, i.e. English, and academic and intellectual capability and potential. And I suspect that traditionally teachers too easily and too often make that false correlation as well. And what we've got to do as a school now is address this and educate our children that just because their English is a way behind does not mean that they are not capable of amazing things. And for me, this graph was one of the most fascinating things that came out of our work on PASS in CAT 4, because this is helping us to understand the typical mindset of the Bromsgrove student, which is someone who thinks that the teachers are great, but they're not. Someone who thinks that they're really not able at all, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And the last graph I'll share with you, again, quite interesting for us. This is looking at curriculum fit. So across the bottom on the x-axis, I have their mean CAT score. So that's taking in all 4 batteries from 59 to 139, or 141, sorry. And then on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, we have their response to curriculum score. This is the score which is based on the student's belief or otherwise that the curriculum we offer and the style in which we deliver it meets their specific needs. Now, Excel did the line for me, but what this shows to you and to us is that the more able a student is at our school, the more they will feel that the learning experience we provide is suited to them. The less able they are, the less they feel it's suited to them. And for me, that red line there again speaks volumes about some of the strategic decisions we need to make as a school as we move forward. We're a small school, a long way out from the centre of Bangkok, and that we do not have the network that perhaps I would have had in an in-London borough. Nonetheless, we need to explore pathways for our less able students so that they can get a sense of success, so that they do go home each day feeling that what they experienced was right for them, and so that we do achieve the Mona Lisa effect. What all of this is showing is what we all know already, which is that attitude really matters. If a child has a really positive attitude, even if they have low to moderate aptitude, they will do well. If they have a really high aptitude, but their attitude is low, they probably won't. So we spend so much time in schools focusing on the academics, focusing on the current and prior attainment, focusing on the report grades, and yet we risk missing one of the fundamental issues, which is the attitudes of those children and what we need to do about that. Now, if you subscribe to the PASS, what you're then given once the scores come through is some tips about how we could deal with students who have particularly low attitudinal scores in one area or another. And these can be quite useful. Some of these might strike you as teaching a grandmother to suck a few eggs, but others might be a little bit more epiphanous. But what we've found is that these are very generic, and these will get you started. But what we've had as a group of staff is a far more strategic session where we focus on, okay, what will work for our kids? What will work for this particular kid? How can we verify that the score is accurate for them and they weren't just having a bad day? And then crucially, how can we address that deficit. And this is a journey we're only just beginning to tread. Hopefully in a year or so I will be able to share with delegates and anybody else the ground we covered here. But at the moment we're thinking, what then do we do next? What do we do beyond a student is low in self-confidence? Let's praise them a lot. Obviously, that's a little bit facile and simplistic and won't in itself work. If a student's attitudes to teachers are low, let's ask the child whether they like their teachers. Obviously, that's not going to work. So what we're trying to do now is establish a more and more finely tuned and personalized approach to addressing the deficits which exist. And then I'm able to provide for our teachers the baseline data of each year group. And this is what each teacher is given access to. They have the CAPS battery scores, they have the mean CAPS score, they have the spatial bias, but I know there are other webinars that we'll talk to you about, so I won't cover that here. They have what for me is this critical verbal deficit, because in our school, that will tell you so much more about what you need to do with your students than anything else. And then we have all of the past scores. So when you inherit a class or a year group, before you even start to teach that student for the first time, you will see all of this data, and you will have an understanding of where that child is at and how you can get that child to achieve their true potential. I'm going to finish off with a final slide here, which returns to my notion of the Mona Lisa effect. If truly we're going to achieve that alchemy, that wizardry, that magic whereby each student really feels that they're getting a truly personalized education, this is how the data can help us to do so. Let's look at Amy in year 8. We know already that Amy's popular, we know she's good-natured, we know she's eager to please everybody, we know she's hardworking, but we also know that she is shy and reticent, we know she's unlikely to take risks, and we know that she's reluctant to speak out. All of this we knew without any data. You don't need data to get to know a student in terms of soft data like this. But now, with the CAPS and the PASS, we know more. We know her aptitude. We know that Amy is exceptionally able. We know she's got a 9th Stay 9 score for quantitative and spatial. That's exceptionally high. And her non-verbal score is in the 8th Stay 9. So 3 of her 4 battery scores are very, very high indeed. And we know that now. But we also know that she's got a verbal deficit of 28, and therefore she's massively impeded by her level of English language acquisition. And we know all that from the CAPS. We know from her prior attainment and her current attainment that it's good. It's not amazing, but it's good. She's on target in her 3 core subjects, but she's not getting straight A's. And I would argue that a student with these sorts of CAPS scores should be getting outstanding results if we can just address that verbal deficit, we can just sort out that verbal aptitude. And then from the PASS, we know this. We know from her PASS survey that she's got exceptionally positive attitude towards her teachers and to the school in general. She thinks this school is amazing. She thinks her teachers are wonderful. She thinks we couldn't be doing more. And yet when it comes to judgments about herself, we know she's got a very low self-worth. We know she thinks she's incredibly weak. She thinks she has no potential whatsoever in terms of academic and academic performance. And we also know that she doesn't feel she's very motivated, and she doesn't feel that the curriculum we offer is appropriate for her. Now, we can argue that her perception is wrong now, that she should have a high self-worth, that she should realize how amazing she is, and that she has every reason to push herself in an academic environment which is very well suited to her. But we cannot escape the fact that she believes differently. And I reckon if we knew all of these things about every student we teach, this profile truly enables us to achieve the Mona Lisa effect, which I referred to at the beginning, and which is essential if we're truly to personalize every single child's learning experience at school.